Hello and welcome to the Last Wicket. I'm your host Benny. Thank you for joining us. Once again, I'm joined by my co-host Mike. Hey Mike,
Hey, Benny.
and our frequent returning guest, very much in demand for the Last Wicket listeners, or so we'd like to think, because we haven't really checked. But it's Ben Brettell. Hey Ben.
Hey Benny, thanks for inviting me again. Maybe don't check.
Yes, I'm not planning to. Uh, Before we get into the meat of this episode, I did want to check in with you, Ben, about how you're feeling about England, how they've been doing. We reached test three, day one. Day two is going to begin soon. But I know by the time this episode comes out, a lot might have changed. But let's just talk about, regardless of the outcome of this test and the series eventually, how do you feel England have done? I guess, okay, let me rephrase that because I think we all know how England have done, but how do you feel as an England fan about just the way things have turned out for Stokes and Men?
I mean, aside from feeling really tired from having been up all night watching it, I feel somewhat disappointed that I don't think England have really shown their potential in the series so far. They haven't, aside from maybe the first day in Perth with the ball, they haven't really played to their potential, which is disappointing. They say it's the hope that kills you, and I think, for the past 15 years, we've gone to Australia, and no England fan has realistically hoped for anything other than the usual drubbing. But this time round was different, and there was some hope, and we thought with the a more positive mindset and the group of players that we were taking out there that it might be different this time. But and especially with Cummins out for the first couple of tests and Hazelwood not playing, you think, well, this is your chance. So it's a bit disappointing that we haven't played to our full potential. I've still got some hope the track in Adelaide looks decent, and hopefully we'll wrap up the tail quickly and make some runs for a change. But yeah, we'll find out shortly.
Is this the best they could have done though? Because, you look at the squad, you look at the 11 selected for the first two games. Bashir didn't feature in either of those. Um, and then, a lot of questions have been raised about Pope and Crawley, but of course, that's nothing new for this England setup. I feel like questions have always been asked about them, and they keep performing to some extent or the other. What did you think about the selection for the first two games?
I th I can understand why they've stuck with Pope and Crawley, particularly Crawley. I think he's that kind of impact player, and they felt that he would do well in Australia. And to be fair, in the second test, he did fairly well. Pope, I mean, I can also see why they stuck with him, but the time to get rid of Pope and think about someone like Jacob Bethell was maybe the beginning of the English summer before the India series, not at the beginning of the Ashes series, particularly given Bethell didn't exactly kick the door down with his form in the white ball stuff in New Zealand. So I think their hand was forced a little bit to stay with Pope. The Bashir conundrum is an interesting one. Having picked him, he's the ultimate poster boy of vibes-based selection, if you like, is the phrase I think. And picked off a TikTok reel and nurtured for 2 years with the view that he would be suitable for Australia and that high release point and all the rest of it. And then to not pick him seems quite strange. And you can kind of see with the Perth wicket why you would not necessarily pick a frontline spinner, and then again in the pink ball game, even Australia didn't pick a frontline spinner. But then Adelaide, where it's definitely going to turn in the third and fourth innings, you think if you're going to play him, this was the game. So it's
Right.
fairly surprising that they just seem to have kind of abandoned that project. But then if you look at his form for the Lions, I think he took none for 115 in his most recent outing. So maybe he's just kind of unselectable. And Jax is a great cricketer, and they obviously like the fact that he adds potential runs at eight. So you can see the logic, but it is also kind of weird as well.
Right. Obviously, this is a Stokes and McCullum led team where a lot of the choices, a lot of the decisions that they've made over the last few years have been, like you said, based on vibes. And it does, their performance in the first two games, to me, has somewhat lacked it. It's shown sparks from time to time, but never really kind of stayed steady. And I think that's a good segue into what we are talking about today, legacy of coaches, because, as much as the players, McCullum has been in the news a lot, which is funny to me because we never hear about the Australian coach. Sometimes I have to check, wait, who is the Australian coach right now? He's never in the news. But McCullum is like a lightning rod. He's been featured heavily when we talk about England cricket, and obviously now he's taken over the limited oversight as well. So, and we'll go in depth on it, and Mike will kind of lead the flow of the conversation. But as it stands right now, what is your take on how we will remember McCullum? Now, again, I'm not saying that he's going to be done at the end of the series, possibility as always, but given all the achievements by this England team over the last few years, um, what's your early take, let's say, on the legacy of McCullum, or just your thoughts on his stint so far?
I think it's probably too early to say until he's finished. I mean, obviously we haven't really won anything of note yet, which is a concern.
Hmm.
Those the big marquee series against Australia and India have ended in somewhat disappointing draws where you think England probably had good chances to win both of those series and didn't quite get over the line. I think if he's going to be remembered as as a great as one of the great coaches, I think we really have to win one of those one of those big series or a white ball trophy, but that seems further away than winning a big test series. So um, yeah, I think we'll only really be able to assess his legacy once his tenure's finished. But I think I- I'm slightly worried that, we talk about vibes. I'm slightly worried that this England team have kind of lost the vibe and they've maybe started to lose belief in the project. And it's that kind of mindset based project where everyone needs to buy into it 100% to the exclusion of all else. And I think as soon as the cracks start forming in that belief, then it could all unravel quite quickly. I hope it doesn't because I've enjoyed the way England have played cricket over the past 2 or 3 years, and I'd like to see some more of it. But you would actually like to win something as well. So yeah, jury's out for me at the moment.
All right. With that, gentlemen, we'll get into our topic for today. So, just reading about the Ashes and everything that's going on, there was so much going, so many discussions around the legacy of, the man you just talked about, Brendan McCullum, Ben Stokes as captain, and it almost made me think, and this is not, of course, an Ashes only conversation, but it almost made me think about just legacy and how do cricketers themselves think about legacy, and maybe that's where I want to start with. And open to both Benny and Ben, both of you. What are your thoughts around how modern cricketers think about legacy? What are the examples that come to mind from recent past where, because obviously, we think about cricket as a game where you're really focused on the next series and so on and so forth. But obviously, somebody like Joe Root or Steve Smith, who's been around the block quite a bit, who's won quite a lot, who's scored runs all over the place, they are obviously thinking longer term and they're thinking about the mark they're leaving. So yeah, wanted to just open the floor for that before we jump into how coaches or captains shape teams.
It is funny that you came up with this idea for this episode because recently I've been thinking a lot about John Wright. Um, because for Indian cricket, obviously, kind of like McCullum for England, Gautam Gambhir has been in the news a lot for Indian cricket. A lot of dissatisfaction, to put it mildly, given that, India have lost two home series in the last year. Um, and obviously, that is a proud record for India. I remember for most of the last 20 years, that's a matter of pride because when teams did eventually win, that felt like they had to give it their all, exert uh, everything that they had to overcome India in India. And the way that India capitulated first against New Zealand last year and then recently against South Africa, um, it raised a lot of questions about the team selected, the strategy, and a lot of questions are being asked of Gautam Gambhir because he was coach during both occasions, and he's also the kind of personality that attracts it. And even putting my personal thoughts aside, I was just looking at is that a fair criticism to, target the coach when the players are not doing very well? And so I started thinking about John Wright because when I started following cricket, um, at first I didn't really think about who the coach was for each team. And it was only after John Wright was appointed with much fanfare, or when Ganguly was the captain, I kind of learned what kind of a difference a coach can make, in terms of changing attitudes of players, changing the way players and fans think about fitness. Um, Indian players were never the fittest, and that started to change. Of course, it changed dramatically after Virat Kohli came along, but even back then under John Wright, there was so many, efforts put in to change the way India traditionally played. And he was the kind of personality, who, sure, maybe behind closed doors, he was a lot more assertive, but, in public, he did seem to be the ice to Sourav Ganguly's fire, right? And to me, that felt like for John Wright to be remembered as a good coach, probably even a great coach, he needed the right captain around him. Because later he went on to coach other teams too, including New Zealand, I believe, where he didn't really have the same kind of success that he had with India. So that really got me thinking after you mentioned this idea, I was thinking how the legacy of a coach really is probably tied to the players and particularly the captains of the teams because we've talked about this before. There's only so much a coach can do to influence the way that a team plays on the field. Because you can do all the preparation, everything that you can do before the game starts, but after the game begins, it's the players, including the captain, who can make any kind of impact. So to me, I don't think the legacy of a coach can ever be discussed without the kind of players or the captain that he's had.
I'd agree with that, Benny. I think I've been doing quite a lot of thinking on this. It's a really interesting topic with plenty of rabbit holes you can go down. I think to answer the question from Mayank around whether modern cricketers kind of think about their legacy, I think there are two ways of looking at legacy from a cricket perspective. For me, there's kind of players thinking about their numbers or their averages or how they'll be remembered as a player and where they fit into history, how they influence the results of their team. And I think that we can probably all think of players who've focused on this, maybe gone on too long to reach a milestone. I think Steve Waugh was a good example of someone who was accused of going on too long to try and get an elusive final 100. But I think the more important way of thinking about legacy for me really means how a player or coach or a captain's career influences future generations or maybe even the health or the popularity of the sport as a whole. And I think that is a much rarer commodity because even really successful regimes of great captain coach axis tend to collapse when they eventually fail, by which point someone else comes in with a new broom and totally changes the approach. So it makes the potential for legacy limited, I think. The best example that I could think of where a team's created this kind of continuing, lasting legacy is the Australian women's team, because they've just had this sustained brilliance and culture behind it from kind of Meg Lanning era onwards. And I think that success has been really influential in terms of growing the women's game and the girls' game in Australia. And then that in turn's given them this kind of pipeline of players to continue dominating. And I think that was the best one I could think of as a kind of captain coach kind of ethos and culture that's kind of lasted and endured. Um, and I think, then there's some, you can think of players who genuinely changed the game as well, kind of on their own. It's harder than thinking of kind of merely great players. But in the modern era, you've got someone like Saywag, when openers were expected to be cautious, he was a stroke maker, paved the way for the aggressive openers that we see today, like Jaiswal, um, AB de Villiers and his kind of 360 batting. From an England perspective, I'd say Kevin Peterson with his, inventing the switch hit and all this stuff. Adam Gilchrist was another one. Um, Shane Warne and Murali for the spin bowling department. So yeah, there's a few players who've genuinely kind of changed their game and kind of redefined their craft, if you like, but they're few and far between.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, we talk about players, especially when they retire or they're coming close to their end of their careers. We talk about numbers and wickets and runs they've scored. But that example that you gave at the end is probably telling because you said Murley and Warren as wrist spinners, spinners who just had were another class and they just redefined the game. And there was another one in that era who had 600 plus wickets, which is Anil Kumble, but he's not remembered in the same way. And again, this is nothing against Anil Kumble, great cricketer, no doubt, but it was just something about Shane Warne and his aura, the way he conducted himself on the field, the fact that he succeeded despite playing most of his cricket in Australia. All of that just putting together really did redefine um, spin bowling, and I think Jared Kimber talks about this all the time, where he says in the late 90s, once Shane Warne started becoming big, there were every club in Australia had like five wrist spinners because everybody wanted to be the next Warren. And so that is a sort of legacy that is unmatched. No number can really translate into
Mm.
that sort of legacy. And I think modern cricketers do talk about it. Obviously in press conferences after a game or after a World Cup, they may not think about it too much, but in longer form interviews, I feel more and more cricketers these days talk about this. Even as late as last year, Ravindra Jadeja, after the New Zealand Test series loss, was asked about it, and he said, that is the one thing he did not want to do in his career. He had never lost a home Test series, and he was really disappointed about it, and he wished that was not on his legacy. So, obviously, these cricketers do think about it, especially after they've been around the team for a while, they've performed consistently or they won consistently. Um, but yes, I do think like we often judge teams, and this is where the Ashes conversation comes in a little bit. And Ben, curious on your thoughts here, but it felt to me, especially after the first test and the way it ended quickly in 2 days, um, that a lot of people were saying the second test really makes or breaks Bazball and their legacy. And to me, just the way you described it, it's more than runs. It's getting people back into Test cricket, whatever other ways people remember your legacy for the national team. That has to be more than just one game or one series.
Yeah, I think I mean, I suppose it's a bit like reputations. It takes a long time to earn one and not very long to destroy one. Um, I also think England cricket's obsession with the Ashes is slightly annoying because there's more to cricket than the Ashes. But like it or not, I think for English cricketers and captains and coaches, you are ultimately judged and defined in history by how you performed against Australia. And so this series does take on a huge importance in terms of, how Stokes and McCullum will be remembered as as captain and coach. Um, so yeah, I think they'll, they'll be very keen to win this test, put it that way.
Absolutely. I think the one thing as we deep dive into the deep, we do a deep dive into this topic, we we want to just look at what are the factors that help, really evaluate a legacy of coach, captain, and I don't want to restrict it to a coach or captain, the director of cricket in England's case. So like we're in India's case, we should bring all of them in because obviously they all work together to create that impact over, 2 years, 3 years, whatever tenure they have. So as we get into it, we obviously want to talk about all the factors that go into creating this legacy. And Benny obviously hit on one already, which is just the strength of the team. I think that was is an obvious one. If Brendan McCullum or Charles Dravid or whoever your favorite coaches comes and tries to coach my club team here in Chicago, we're probably not going to be MLC minor league level or IPL level, just because we're not good enough. So obviously, many of these coaches who get a lot of accolades, and many of them rightly get those accolades, also have a very strong team to back that up with. And I think that's sometimes easy to forget. It's great to write stories about how this coach turned it around, but New Zealand, for example, suddenly produced a battery of fast bowlers, and suddenly they were a lot more competitive than they've ever been before. So, without those fast bowlers, Mike Hessen wouldn't be able to have what he did. And I think that's obviously important to keep track of. But let's talk about the other thing, which is winning. So obviously, nothing builds the legacy of a team or management like winning consistently. Um, Benny, I'll bring you in. I think you touched on it already a little bit, but thoughts on that and how do you see, just winning makes people forget all the other things you do. And I certainly have a couple of examples from, India from the past decade. Uh, but I'll bring you in first to get your thoughts on that.
I also realized I never truly answered your first question. But, that does tie into what you asked about, though, because, Ashwin, recently there was a report. I think this was soon after the Test series loss, India's Test series loss to South Africa. Ashwin said that after the 2012 loss to England, he felt so low, like because again, a proud record, and then they had lost. So he said he never wanted to feel have that get that feeling again. And he had made a decision that if he was to be part of another team that lost another home series, he would be done. Like he would just retire. And so soon after they lost to New Zealand, of course, he did go to Australia, but he had pretty much made up his mind. At least it sounded like he had made up his mind that he was going to be done at that point. So players do take all of this into account because imagine if he had not lost a test series at home throughout his whole playing career, that would be like a trivia question. Which cricketers have played their entire career without losing, like 10 or more years without losing a home series. So players do think about their legacy, especially as winners, especially as champions. And I think this goes to especially the Australian men, winning multiple World Cups over the years. Yes, the women's team too, but especially, the legacy that they created that even now, the gold standard when we talk about champion teams, we always talk about how does team X compare to the Australian team of the 2000s? So it's a team winning automatically creates a standard that other teams are aspiring to. So when these players are done playing, and eventually most of them move to the commentator pool, they love to talk about their times, their days as a player and talk about stories, it means so much to them to have been part of a winning side. So yes, winning is definitely a big part of your legacy because who is going to remember? I don't want to take any examples of the worst teams around, but how many like, let's say someone who's played, for about 10, 12 years, but has not accomplished anything, post his playing days, beyond saying, yeah, I used to play for, my country. He doesn't have much else to share or say. But a team like even I know we talked about England not really having much to show for, but I would say basketball does have a legacy regardless of their results. They may not have won some big series yet, but they have changed their percentages at least when it comes to winning, compared to how they were doing under Joe Root just before Stokes and McCullum took over. They did change their winning ways. They did change their approach to things. They were no longer timid. They may have gone a little too extreme the other way, but still, they were producing different results. Now, compare that with a team that's just kind of muddling through, players who are just muddling through in their career and finish with a respectable one. But who are you going to remember more? You're going to remember the teams who changed the results, who started to win, or if not outright win. So, I mean, you think about it, when you started following cricket, who are the players that you started hearing about, or who are the teams? Which are the teams that you heard about? Um, they never talk about the teams that were terrible. They always talk about West Indies from the 70s, Australia to some version, I guess, in the late 80s, and then in the 90s and 2000s. It's always the winners are the ones who get remembered. So it's just an unavoidable part of legacy.
Yeah, I think, and to build on that, I would say winning, yeah, like you say, nobody remembers the poor teams and the losing teams. So winning is important, and I think it's necessary for legacy, but it doesn't automatically create it, if that makes sense. And if we go back to that what I said earlier about the two ways of thinking about legacy, I'm thinking of England's team under Andy Flower here. Yeah, he took them from absolute no hopers to world number one. They won in India, they won the Ashes away, and they won the first ICC trophy, the T20 World Cup. But I think, and obviously that's in the history books, everyone remembers those wins, but how much legacy did that create? His tenure ended quite badly with the Kevin Peterson affair and a shambolic Ashes in 2013, and then Peter Moores took over, and the team were still hopeless, and then he didn't last very long before he got replaced by Trevor Bayliss. So it wasn't this kind of continuing excellence that you see in the example of the Australian women's team I gave. So you can actually see, I think that the whole Bazball project, even if they don't win as much as that team under Andy Flower, they might create more legacy, if that makes sense, because they've changed perceptions about how you can play Test cricket. So, for example, I think teams now are no longer as scared of chasing in the fourth innings as they used to be. It used to be, oh, 200 in the fourth innings. That's too many. We'll block for a draw. Whereas England have shown over the past 3 years that you can go and chase three or 400 and win in the fourth innings. So I think, yeah, winning it is important, but it doesn't automatically create legacy. I think it can be more than that in terms of the influence on how people think about the game and how people ultimately play the game in future.
I think the aspect about winning, I completely agree. I do think it's an important step, but not, not something that guarantees legacy. But the reason I think it's an important first step is it silences a lot of criticism already. So there are a lot of people, for example, with basketball, who said, "Oh, the test game is not supposed to be played this way" when they got started. And those critics had to just shut up because they were able to produce the results. Now, of course, we can argue that the results weren't as great away from home, all of that, but they were substantially better than the era right before. So with nearly the same set of players, much better results is a substantial improvement. And at the end of the day, winning is a very objective thing. Like, you can debate how somebody is managing the team, how the morale inside the team is, because we are all watching from far. These things get very subjective. You have to read the lines. Um, Win-loss ratio, anybody can go to Quick Info and pull that up and look at that. And that's often an easy way to, silence the doubters. So I do think that is one aspect of it. And I think the other aspect is the other coach that I remember, which I know a lot of Indian fans won't remember fondly, is Greg Chappell, who was a very different character. And under him, India used to struggle chasing ODI targets. And he told that to Captain Rahul Dravid, and Rahul decided we're going to bowl first every single time we win the toss. And they ended up getting so much better at it. Of course, we had the likes of Yuvraj and Dhoni hitting their peaks during that period, but um, that meant we won 16 one days back to back chasing. And that was a world record. I still believe that holds true. And so that is sort of the legacy that it created because, of course, later when things went south, we heard all the issues that were going on with Greg Chappell, with the way he managed the team. He was, not a great man manager, so to say, just, terrible for the morale. But all of that gets sidelined once if you keep winning. And I think that's really why winning is obviously a key element. And whenever we talk about the great teams, as Benny was alluding to them, they all won. It did not matter if they had things not, weren't the smoothest in between. And I read Steve Waugh's book, his autobiography many years ago, and that's he talked about it even then that when they won the '99 World Cup, there was still a lot going on in the background. Like he wasn't getting along super well with Shane Warne, his star performer. There were things constantly being said about Mark Waugh, even within the Waugh family. There was health issues and things going on, which concerned the Waugh brothers. So there was a lot on their mind, but because they just kept somehow managing to get over the line, um, it started getting forgotten, and that's where the so-called start of the Australian dynasty of the 2000s, happened. So it just brought a lot of small things together, and obviously it wasn't like just being determined. A lot of things just fell into their place, whether it's that Alan Donald run out or a drop catch by Herschel Gibbs. That we could count a number of things that went their way. Obviously, the sport is very complex and small areas of luck come into the picture, but it really ensured that Steve Ball was remembered for a World Cup winning team. The the other aspects that we should absolutely jump into is some of the more subjective topics. So with that, we've talked about the win-loss ratio, of course, but Ben, I'll let you go first on what else do you think really helped shape that.
I think, and you touched on this already when you were talking about Steve Waugh and Shane Warne not getting on, but it's very it's almost impossible to overstate the importance of man management skills here. Um, you know, Captaincy and leadership styles are obviously unique, and it's your job as a leader, whether that's in business or in sport, is to get the best out of a diverse set of people and get them all pulling in the same direction. And the best captains and the best business leaders all have that in common, that they're able to do that. And I think, one kind of stain on Andy Flower's record as England coach was that I don't think, got the best out of Kevin Peterson. I know KP was a spiky character and by all accounts quite difficult to get on with in the dressing room, but it's your job to get the best out of that guy, and he was obviously phenomenally talented. So I think that's a kind of failure of man management. I think going back a bit from an England perspective, the best example I can think of is Mike Brearley, who's renowned as our greatest ever captain, and he was really kind of known for his exceptional tactical acumen, but also his man management skills. And he was in the team almost as a specialist captain because his record with the bat was, I think he averaged somewhere around 20, but he was in there as almost a specialist captain. And I think, that is his legacy, that he changed the way people think about man management and captaincy. And then afterwards, he became a psychoanalyst and an author. There's a famous quote from Rodney Hogg that Brearley had a degree in people, and that compensated for his average of 20 and made him have this legacy as our greatest ever captain. So yeah, I think that man management is super important. And you mentioned the kind of dynasties as well, and I think that's really interesting where you have an outgoing leader and then you have a kind of disciple situation where, for example, is Harry Brook going to try, when Stokes goes, is Harry Brook going to try and carry on in the same vein as Stokes and kind of continue this ethos, or will he try something different? It's really interesting.
Yeah, and before I let Benny chime in, the one other piece of man management that's critical is, obviously like just having the right people pulling in the right direction, managing their egos, their, whatever their goals are, having them all aligned is obviously critical, and something that obviously person to person, it really varies because you see, and I can speak a lot more about the Indian dressing room in the last decade, but you saw that Ravi Shastri was somebody who, as coach would publicly speak his mind, and sometimes it would rub people the wrong way. R. Ashwin, for example, didn't particularly like when in 2018 he called Kuldeep Yadav the number one spinner that the Indian team had, just because of his variety. But at the same time, that same coach, when working with Rishabh Pant and trying to push him the right direction, was able to use a similar approach and get him to get perform at his peak. So that's the other reason why man management is so challenging, because it is so subjective. Everybody looks at it in a very different manner and receives the same, same treatment in very different manner. Um, Benny, I'll let you go next.
The examples you guys just mentioned, Ben, in your case, you mentioned KP, the way KP was handled, and then Mike, like your example of Shastri with like someone like Punt, for example. I mean, these are just great examples to really talk about the importance of man management because that can make or break a team, you know, regardless of the performances themselves, winning or losing, keeping that aside, keeping a team together, making sure everyone is on the same page instead of kind of pulling in different directions, or like some other teams, forming factions within the team, and then it's just miserable, and then we hear all these stories later. So I think is just unavoidable. In fact, that should be probably the number one criteria that coaches or potential coaches would have to be interviewed on, I would assume. It's kind of like outside of sports too, just in corporate culture. If you interview for a manager position, they want to know your people skills. How are you going to manage people? How do you tailor your approach to each individual, or are you going to be like, my way is the way that we're going to do? Which to me does seem, from at least from the outside, it seems like that's what McCollum, espoused all these years, and it worked or works to some extent. But when it goes bad, you're, all the recent news reports coming out of Australia like suggest that when it goes well, it goes great, but when it goes bad, then you get all these criticisms. But yeah, I just feel that it's just an intricate, integral part of how a coach would be remembered for, because all the great coaches that I can think of, right from like let's say Bob Simpson, Bob Woolmer, Gary Kirsten. Forget Dave Watmore. These are in my mind, these are the legendary coaches. And to me, all of them have that same trait in which they were coach of a team, but they also knew how to manage the individual player. They were able to bring out the best in a player. And that's why I give a lot of credit to someone like Ravi Shastri, because he was coaching a team that had stars, veterans, but also the newer, the younger players who are still making their mark. And I think coaches for the Indian team generally struggle with that. But he just seemed to get like it perfect, like that metric perfect on how to get the best out of someone. Like, what do I need to do to get this player to perform to the best of his capability? So, no, that is just integral to what makes a good coach. Again, regardless of performance, how a coach is going to be remembered is just very vital.
One of the other things I want to talk about is sort of the culture that is set by, management. I think Benny, you talked about Virat Kohli, or maybe even before John Wright, improving the fitness of the Indian cricket team in the early 2000s. I remember he brought along Andrew Lupus, who was, the first time India had a physiotherapist with them traveling all the time. They were starting to be actual professional sportsmen, which was obviously a big change. Then, obviously, in the Virat Kohli era, the things like yo-yo test became mandatory, so you had to pass them. I believe now that's changed to a different test, but nonetheless, those standards are still maintained, and which is why they've set a benchmark of, if you're not this fit, doesn't matter how skillful you are, you're not going to be in the team. And that is almost one of the conversations that I think Bharat Arun has revealed in recent times, where he brought the idea of introducing Bumrah as a test bowler at a point where he had only played a couple of years of one day and T20 cricket. And the first question Ravi Shastri asked is, can he bowl 25 overs in a day? If he's ready to do that, he definitely has the skills. So that was sort of the standard that team set, and obviously that's paid really good dividends, because not just is the Indian team the 11 or the 15 that play for the India, whether in Test or T20s, really fit now, but if you look at domestic cricketers these days are extremely fit, and they're spending their own resources and making sure that they're taking fitness to another level. Not just with the men's team. Smriti Mandana, there was a really wonderful article after the World Cup win where she spent lakhs of rupees to create a full training facility in her hometown. Oh, she did that all by herself. She hired the same trainer that trains India's badminton stars, and she had him fly back and forth between Maharashtra and Hyderabad all the time to make sure that she was training for the best. And the improvement in her game has obviously been immense. So just that standard again, like Smriti Mandana did not push that down into the Indian women's team. But the fact that the leader is, or the vice captain is setting that as the standard, that as the acceptable standard, does have an impact. And some of the interviews that we've seen after the World Cup, a lot of the youngsters, whether it's Amanjot Kaur, whether it's Jamima Rodriguez, they've said all these things that watching the way Harmanpreet and Smriti were working after a T20 World Cup loss really inspired them and pushed them. So that definitely is a big part of legacy. And I think that would have been for the Indian women's team, even if they had lost that final against South Africa or that semi-final against Australia, would have gone a long way in terms of how they've changed, the quality of cricket that they play, and the quality of fielding in particular that they show. Um,
I'll just
Go.
very quickly comment on that because, a lot of what a coach does, we don't really know, right? From the outside, we can't really judge a coach effectively because we have discussed this before. Only the players themselves are the best, witnesses, so to speak, of how a coach is in the dressing room and how he handles, each player and like tough phases for a team. But one of the few things that we as fans can see from the outside and really understand how the state of the dressing room or the state of the team is, yeah, how have they improved in terms of their just the culture, the team culture that is, because that is something you can't really hide within a dressing room. Is the way they carry themselves on the field, is the way you see them bonding with each other and during practice sessions. How are That's one of the few things that we can judge from the outside. And to me, again, going back to just the Indian team and how they've evolved over the years, I started following Indian cricket at a time where, I'm used to people who, players who would escort the ball to the boundary rather than trying to stop it. Nobody would dive, be it when they're running or fielding. And then fast forward when we got this influx of these new trainers and coaches, you could see a change in the way people were eating, players were eating, players were training, and how they were also, how this carried over on the field. And I can't all lay it on the captain because guess who? Guess who our captain was? It was Saurav Ganguly. He was one of the prime culprits because he hated to run. And so when you see that as a change happening, and of course Virat Kohli came in at the right time to really drive that and emphasize its importance. The way that fitness has evolved in Indian cricket, it's a great example of how that culture, that mindset has changed. And for all of that, it had to be the coaches, not just the main coach, the head coach, but all these fielding coaches who come in and then they get the buy-in from the players who are ready to make those changes, make those slight changes to the way they eat, whether when they're playing and when they're not playing, the way they train during the off season, things like that. And so yeah, that is again, band management is critical. Standards and culture that is set by the management is important. And again, not necessarily this that would it's not necessarily that would guarantee results, that suddenly the team starts winning, but it starts with something small like that. Even take India's approach to T20 cricket in recent years. For the longest time, they were very conservative in the way they played. And that changed very recently, where, and again, the skills were always there, but someone had to step in and say, okay, this is the way we're going to have to play. So let's train towards changing our approach to it. So it has to come from the top and it has to come from management. And that's the only way we can see that they are making a difference.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and I think you can see, I mean, what you need is preferably the captain, but somebody to lead by example. And I think you can see that with the England team and Ben Stokes. He famously trains harder than anyone, and really kind of inspires the team to do the same. And you talk about the things, Ganguly and escorting the ball to the boundary. One of England's core values under Stokes and McCullum is chase every lost cause. And so
One of
yeah,
the other
that's I think I was reading, I can't remember them all now, but they have five or six core values, and one of them is as simple as just chase every ball to the boundary, whether you think you're going to get it or not.
Yeah, and one of the other aspects, which is in my mind very much tied to the culture, is vision. And I think this is something that is, at least in my mind, a little bit easier to evaluate. And I say that because we've seen like coaches will take decisions, or even selectors for that matter, will take decisions which might seem left field, and but there's a certain vision behind it. They are trying to do something different for whatever reason. And I think that is one other aspect that ties pretty close to the culture, making sure you're setting the right standards, you're managing your men so that they're not insecure if they get dropped for a specific game. All of that is, of course, important. But and of course hoping that some of that leads to more consistent results, but the vision aspect is something that I often feel gets talked about quite less. So I'll talk about the Indian setup right now. Obviously Gautam Gambhir has been getting a lot of hate and anger and all of that considering the results, but one of the people in the current Indian setup that I particularly like is Indian selector Ajit Agarkar, the former pacer, who's now the the chairman of selectors. Rahul Dravid, when the former coach, when he was going out, was asked about some of the changes he made as coach, and the changes included, making sure that we moved on from Riddhiman Saha as wicketkeeper and said pushed for Rishabh Pant. And even when Rishabh Pant got injured, they did not go back to Saha. They wanted to try somebody new, somebody younger. Same thing with our pace attack. We moved on from Umesh Yadav, who had, even though he had been very successful with the SG ball at home, had not shown the same results abroad. So there were a lot of these players that we moved on in Rahul Dravid's era, and he was very honest in giving credit to Ajit Agarkar, saying that Ajit Agarkar and company were very, very pushy on trying to move forward and think longer term. Um, and I think this is something that is, easier to look at in hindsight, but it is certainly something that is very important because, like another example for Ajit Agarkar's tenure is Dhruv Jurel, the wicketkeeper batter that India have picked. Another sort of left, sort of pick that you would not expect. There's a lot of wicket keepers in Indian domestic cricket who scored a lot of runs, but when Rishabh Pant got injured, they picked Dhruv Jurel, who had played season and a half of Ranji Trophy. So, and clearly that pick was well thought out. They had, they had the scouts to sort of validate that. So, Ben, yeah, maybe I'll pass it on to you for any thoughts on vision or any other factors that you think are important.
I think having that long-term vision is really crucial. And what you were saying made me think about probably the biggest turnaround I can remember for English cricket, which was the build up from 2015 being absolutely awful at ODI cricket, a real low point into winning the World Cup in 2019, and that was a meticulously well thought out plan based on teams of analysts and looking at the data and working out exactly what factors were key to winning ODIs in that modern era. And I think they did genuinely change the game, and they changed scoring rates, and they changed approaches to bowling, and wicket taking. And I think yeah, that was such a good example of forward planning and vision, and obviously it came off just. Um, yeah, I think vision is super important, and maybe the current England team have got a vision, but it doesn't quite seem to be working so far. But we'll see.
Absolutely. I think the one other aspect that comes to mind, and I'm glad Benny touched on Bob Woolmer, because it's the tactical in-game, things that some coaches do much better than others. There were back in the day that Bob Woolmer used to have a TV series where he would talk about all these tricks and trades of cricket, and it would be very simple things. It would be like, a wicket keeper when he or she there is collecting a throw from a fielder should have their hands in front of the stumps rather than behind, because then the ball travels less distance and then you break the stumps, moving your hands in the direction of the ball. So it's something small like that which could make millimeter, millisecond of a difference. But it was small tricks like that which just showed that Bob Wilmore was a step ahead. Back in 2007, even coaches were not teaching that. Forget coaches, even commentators were not saying that is the right way to do things. And it did not really become a popular adapted method until maybe 2012s, 2015s. So certain coaches are just a little bit ahead in terms of tactical things that they do in the game. Um, and I think that also is something that is a little bit harder to judge because they might try something which might seem left field and then suddenly the results don't go their way. So that is probably a harder thing to judge in my mind. But are there certain coaches or captains that you think were better in that aspect than others?
Are you talking about tactics
Yeah,
when it
just
comes to
in
this?
in in field tactics, because obviously you can do so much planning, but the game plays out a certain way, and then you have to kind of adapt on the go.
Yeah, the biggest example I can think of, just recency bias, of course, but Ashish Nehra in the IPL. He's
I was not expecting that answer, I will be honest.
he's just so involved, because it fascinates me because like in in soccer, you have coaches, on the sidelines, like waving at players and like speaking to their players and the captain about like what they can do and all that stuff. And Nera is the closest I can think of. He's always just like walking by the boundary roads, passing instructions to the captain and stuff like that. But again, how do you judge the effectiveness of these? His team did win the IPL in his first stint, so I guess, and made it to the final the following year. So there's, I guess, something is working. Overall, though, as far as international sides go, and again, this goes to the captain that the coach has got, right? Because someone like Bob Woolmer, he had what Hansi Cronje with South Africa, um, and they found a good combination and they got things working. They were winning. Bob Boomer tried it with Pakistan. I don't think they won too much. So it really depends on the players and the captain that you got because, again, on the field, the captain makes the calls. And if the captain is not aligned with what the coach has in mind, it's just not going to work. And I think that kind of ties in to something Ben mentioned, yeah, about vision because again, when basketball at its finest is everything kicking in gear, everything working together, the coach, the captain, the players, they're all in sync, then amazing things happen. But when that vision gets muddled, when they get confused, then that's what you get, in the first two tests of this Ashes. Because what they say to the press and their performance in the field, that don't align. And the statements that McCullum makes and Stokes makes, they don't align. So it really is, you talk about vision, you talked about tactics. Uh, Everyone needs to be on the same page. Yeah, and the coach cannot do everything by himself. And that's why, as much as I don't like Gambir personally, um, and this seems like the perfect time to kind of essentially, join the bandwagon and trash him. Um, the players cannot escape criticism either. They may not be super experienced in Test cricket, but they still play a lot of cricket. They play a lot with international alongside international players and against international players. They play in high pressure environments a lot, and they have domestic cricket experience. So don't put the blame all on Gambhir's feet. The players have to stand up and perform as well. So all of that to say, as far as tactics are concerned, I just think that the game is just so much more different to how it was 10, 15 years ago. We have multiple formats. We have a one-day series happening this week. Next week will be T20, and 2 weeks later it's Test cricket. And unless the team has separate coaches for separate formats, it's really hard to form like a cohesive strategy. You need to have the right personnel in place to get those implemented. Um, and honestly, sometimes I feel leave the tactics to the captain on the field. The last thing you want is the coach in his ear, because I'm sure he has enough players on the field to share their thoughts, other senior players. Do all the prep you want off the field, and on the field, leave it to the captain. So I think tactics, and just like strategic planning for specific games. Um, the coach should have an input, obviously, like Bob Boomer did, but then he's Bob Boomer. He is one of the greats. So not every coach can be that. So best to leave it to the captain who is in the moment and who's on the field who can make a difference.
I think just to build on that as well, I think in the shorter format, certainly T20, so much of it is now data driven
Yeah.
as well that it almost seems formulaic. It's like some of that
Hmm.
decision making, it used to be the captain, and in Test cricket maybe still more so, but it used to be the captain does a lot of it on kind of gut feel, right? It's time for this guy
Yeah.
to bowl, or we'll put a short leg in, or we'll go to the short ball plan. But nowadays there's so much data that's influencing the decisions on the field. It's this guy's got a slightly lower strike rate against left arm spin, so next over left arm spin from this end, and it's all about matchups. And
Yeah.
so I think does this is a question rather than a statement, but does that mean captaincy is becoming less important in certainly in the shorter formats because data is now driving a lot of the decisions?
I think that'd be a fascinating separate podcast episode. But my short answer to that is yes. I genuinely believe that captaincy is becoming more managing the team with the backroom staff rather than, the more Imran Khan style late 90s where it was, hey, I'm gonna run the team the way I want it and back them the way I want it. So I do think that's true. But
No,
on that,
short of the format, definitely I think less role for the captain to play. But in a test match, I don't know how much like data can help you once you're on the field. Once plan A goes to, you know, you still need a captain, someone that
Mm.
the players can turn to for guidance. In T20s, you can kind of like the game could be over in a matter of 2 overs. So, yeah.
yeah. But on that note, I want to spend, we've talked about certain factors we all look at when evaluating the legacy of a captain or coach or even, chairman of selectors. I want to spend a little bit of time looking at certain combinations from the last couple of decades. I'll probably give one to each of us. So, Ben, I'll start with you. And if you want to talk about Andrew Strauss as director of cricket with Owen Morgan and their impact on England cricket.
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, that's probably the biggest turnaround we've ever seen from being completely useless at something to being number one in the world. Um, we'd been so bad at white ball cricket and especially ODIs, and we just always seemed behind the curve. By the time we'd caught up and worked out that you need to do X, the good teams were all already doing something else. Um, in terms of in terms of the lasting legacy, I'm not quite convinced by that. I mean, obviously everyone remembers the World Cup. It was in the history books. We will remember the commentary. It was fantastic as an English supporter, but if you look at our ODI side now, we've gone back to the dark days of 2015. So I don't, you haven't got that lasting legacy. We've gone back to being behind the curves. The old methods aren't working anymore. The other teams have caught up and then overtaken us. And in an astonishing kind of almost anti-legacy move, at the same time, the ECB seemed to have deprioritized the entire format. From right after the World Cup win, they've kind of deprioritized or almost got rid of the domestic 50 over tournament and
Right.
yeah, it seems like ODI cricket is no longer a priority, and you reap what you sow. And so, in terms of lasting legacy from that brilliant Strauss and Morgan era, it doesn't it doesn't seem to have lasted, unfortunately.
I
Um,
want to challenge that a little bit. And I mean, I completely agree that England's white ball struggles have been a little bit surprising, considering, especially the batting talent that they have.
mm,
There's no doubt that it's gone down worse than I had thought. I thought after 2019, they're going to continue to be top three team, if not, top two. Uh, but the reason I want to challenge that a little bit is you talk about data and, Owen Morgan was probably one of the first people who had Nathan Lehman just sit on the sideline and show random boards or codes, which meant whatever strategy. And at that point, whether he was doing it with England, whether he was doing it at KKR in the IPL, it seemed really foreign. It seemed like, no idea what is going on. But today, when you look at literally every big franchise across the world, every major team across the world, they are working with the likes of, Cricinfo, they're working with Analytics, they're working with, CricWiz, and all of those people who really understand the data behind the cricket. So in that aspect, I do
mm.
think it has a lasting legacy. I do understand from an English standpoint that may not mean too much if they continue to perform poorly in a
That's
World Cup.
that is a really good point. As an aside, have you read Nathan Lehman's book?
I have, yes. It's
Yeah,
sitting
good.
somewhere here.
Yeah.
Um, Benny, I'll go to you next for Gary Kirsten and MS Dhoni, the famous couple, the famous duo that got India the 2011 World Cup.
Yes, that's what they're remembered for. But do you know what else they're remembered for?
World number one test side.
Yes, that too. Okay, well, do you remember what else you remember? Or, you know, that's the team or that's the combination um, that really placed an emphasis on inducting youngsters and phasing out the seniors. It didn't happen all in one go, obviously. It didn't all happen necessarily uh, when Gary Kirsten was there. But I remember when um, Sachin and was it Sehwag? I think they were during the Tri Series in Australia. They were rested. They were not, Dhoni didn't pick them for some games, and there was all this. It was there was a huge uproar. Like how could you do that? These are senior players. These are respected legends. All that stuff. And meanwhile, the coach and captain are trying to pick a combination not just for that game, but also trying to give some players some chances. And so it was a clash of this culture and the sporting part of it, the sports of it all. And that's where, like we talked earlier about culture. They made a huge difference. Sure, we talking about the number one, becoming the number one test side, winning the World Cup. The performances are the end result, right? Because that's the result of everything that goes on behind the scenes, all the preparation and finding the right players, getting the right combination. But again, like I mentioned earlier, you need to have the right coach and captain in place so that they're all on the same page. And you need a big change in culture. The Indian team needed a big change in the way they were doing things, and those were the right men for the job. Those were not easy calls to make. We knew, you mentioned Greg Chappell earlier. You know, it's easy to, in hindsight, to look back and say he was like a terrible coach or he just didn't work well. But he had the right intentions. He had the right ideas. He probably didn't execute it well. Um, and so this combination, they were able to do it in a way that they didn't let the results drop off. And they made it clear to an Indian fan base, which still to this day struggles with placing certain players on a pedestal at the cost of the team. Uh, they essentially showed the Indian cricket fan base that, listen, the team comes first. Yes, so and so player has accomplished so many things, but how many cups or trophies or top rankings do we have to show for it? And just that change in culture that they did, um, and again, we just had the right people. Gary Kirsten was a perfect coach for Indian cricket because he knew when to step back and not be in the limelight. He was like a complete antithesis of Gautam Gambhir. He never wanted to. He never liked being in the spotlight. And MS Dhoni too. He was being the calm person that he is. He was the best person who could handle all those criticisms and like able to get through to the seniors on one hand and essentially communicate like, okay, this is how we're gonna go about it, but at the same time also take care of a young team at that time. Um, it definitely helped that he had the 2007 T20 World Cup win, which is essentially his credentials to say, Listen, I was able to lead this team to a trophy win with these players, so give me a chance in the longer formats as well." So to me, that was a significant change in the way, not just the way we play, like not just the way the Indian cricket team plays, but putting the team always first rather than players first. And I think, even in the days of Rohit versus Kohli, I think it's really important for the Indian fans to remember that.
Mhm. Do you see him as India's greatest ever coach, Benny?
Gary Kirsten,
Yeah.
I don't know, it's hard for me to look past Ravi Shastri just because I do love the combination of Ravi Shastri and Kohli and what they've accomplished. I know they didn't win any ICC trophies, but
Yeah,
yeah,
two test series in Australia.
that's a big deal for me. That's a huge deal for me because, when Ravi Shastri took over, I was one of his biggest detractors. I remember saying on one of our episodes that he's a glorified cheerleader because he was just always backing, like, Virat Kohli. And I got the sense that he was disappointed because he just wanted the gig and not for any merits. And subsequently, based not just the results, but based on what I've read and heard from players and other coaches, I can see the work that he put in. Um, so and like Mike, referred to like the Australian series win, especially the one with Rahane when he took over as captain, like that to me is probably my fondest cricket memory as a fan in the last 10, 12 years. And maybe when I look back and and take stock of the last 25, 30 years, maybe I'll put Gary Kirsten slightly above, but right now I would say Ravi Shastri is probably slightly just over Kirsten as my favorite coach. Best coach, I think that's up for debate, honestly.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I'm gonna show my bias towards being a Dravid fanboy for 20 years and say Dravid has to be in the top three, but that's a debate for another day. Um, I think the third. I mean, I agree with some of the points you made, Benny. Like it's true. I completely forgot about the fact that not only did they, change the culture and how relaxed the dressing room was, but they started dropping the likes of Dravid and they moved on from Ganguly and Kumble, and well, Kumble was maybe slightly before Dhoni, but nonetheless the others. And yes, it was started by Greg Chappell, didn't go down as well. It wasn't handled as well, but he did that a lot more smoothly. So definitely a defining moment and defining era of Indian cricket. And I think Ajit Agarkar, going back to the point I was making about the chairman of selectors, has gone one further by pushing out the likes of Kohli and Rohit from the test team. That is something unprecedented in Indian cricket. And so, yeah, we're definitely, I think, headed in the right direction. Um, the third combination that I want to talk about is a little bit different because I think with England, they won the 2019 World Cup. With India, they won the 2011 World Cup. Both teams had, really good, well, maybe definitely India had really good test credentials in that time period as well. Um, New Zealand under Mike Hesson and Brendan McCullum, the 2013 to 2016 period, is a little bit different. But I still think there's reason to believe that Mike Hesson is a phenomenal coach. And one reason is we talked about in-game tactics and how you read the game. And I genuinely think Mike Hesson is one of the smartest people in world cricket right now. He had now not so active YouTube channel which he was using, I think, last year during the PSL, during the IPL, and he was explaining various aspects of the game. He was doing previews of games, and it was really just insightful. It was clear to me that similar to Andy Flower and Nathan, Andrew Strauss and Owen Morgan, the people who use data really well, he was able to look at data and then form tactics around it. So that is one reason for it. The second reason is, of course, in until that era, New Zealand, of course, was I would say a middling side. They were not terrible at any point, but they weren't outstanding either. And that was when they started to do really well. Um, no ICC trophies in that era. 2015, they reached the final, looked really good, but then lost to Australia. Um, but I think that was a start of their test dominance as well. They got so much better with test cricket after that. And the reason it gets tricky with Mike Hesson is there was one, senior player who was sort of snubbed off and removed from captaincy, and that was, of course, Ross Taylor. So the legacy gets really murky because the way that was handled, Brendan McCullum happily stepped up and took the job and led really well. But Ross Taylor has been candid in his post his retirement and saying that was a period where he felt lost. And as somebody who's scored, I think, the second highest runs for New Zealand, to alienate a guy like that is obviously a big deal. So I would say not as, a happy era as India can say under Gary Kirsten, but nonetheless, tactically very smart coach. They were willing to willing to rub off one player incorrectly because they felt Brendan McCullum was the right captain to lead. And I think that led to a lot of results going in their favor. And then, 2015 World Cup final was obviously a fantastic, not the result they were hoping on that day, but until that day, they were unbeaten in that World Cup. And since then, their ascendancy also started. So from that perspective, I do think that captain combination has a really good legacy on New Zealand cricket.
And arguably provided the blueprint for what we're seeing now with England.
Absolutely, yeah, that's very true. Yeah, after that, that's where Brendan McCullum, joined forces with Ben Stokes, and they're doing what they're doing now.
And that's the thing too, right? Like you have to make those unpopular choices. I mean, in maybe hindsight, you can judge it and say, well, that was not the right decision, but you still have to admire the conviction and the guts to take that call because it could have been easy to just coast along with like, quote unquote senior player, like a legend, and then nothing happens, or the changes that you want to see does not happen, and then you get criticized, and then you just fade away, and that's your legacy, or of someone who was no different from his predecessors. So I admire anyone who has a conviction to make a change and make the unpopular call. Even like Brendan McCullum for, yes, he's a target. He's like this lightning rod for all criticisms when things go wrong. But I admire the fact that when he became coach, he said, "Listen, the way that England have been playing obviously has not been working. You have one win in the last 14 tests. Let's try this approach. England has got natural, a lot of the players, even in domestic cricket, a lot of natural stroke players, obviously playing well in limited overs at that time. And let's bring that to the long format, right? Now, when it first started, it felt like everybody was just waiting for it to fail so they could just laugh uh, at England's expense. But, things changed. Confidence came back. Players they were getting the results. you know, Players like Harry Brook came along, and now he is, a future captain in waiting, essentially. And so, even though things are not going as well right now, it's undeniable that they brought about a change in the way they approach the game in the long format, and it's all because someone like Brendan McCullum came and said, "We're going to try this. We may fail from time to time. People are going to question our approach. They're going to question why we're not playing the traditional way." But this is what I believe is best for this team. It may not work with every other team, but for this team, this is what's going to work. So let's do it. And so I admire that. And coaches who are willing to make those calls.
And yeah, talk about tough decisions. Probably the biggest one was Jimmy Anderson, and who was probably
Yeah.
retired against his will or earlier than he would have
Yeah.
wanted. And yeah, that was
And
clearly
again, unpopular, right?
unpopular at the time, unpopular with Jimmy, certainly.
Yeah.
But yeah, a tough decision to get rid of a senior player for the good of the team.
Yeah, I don't think Jimmy Anderson would have made any difference, honestly. I mean, I know he's still playing and getting wickets, all of that stuff, but I don't think he would have made. I think his effectiveness was kind of fading in his last few games, and I think that was the right call at that time.
I agree with you. I think it was the right call. I still wouldn't have wanted to have the conversation with him though.
With that, I want to come to our the last question that I had thought of, and which is this almost made me laugh because I was watching some YouTube videos on cricket and the Ashes, and I can't remember where I watched it, but one of the questions I asked was, should teams even worry about the fans? And and my first reaction was, well, isn't it all about the fans? But I think the person who was asking that question alluded to the fact that fans are always going to complain. They're going to always find a way to be unhappy with the team, which I think is true for majority of fans. Like even when India wins at home, they take things for granted until pretty much the last year when we've lost, back to back or 2 out of 3 series. That was always like assumed, and that was not something that people cared about. Or if they won, it would be like, oh well, why was it so close? It should have been more one-sided. We should have won more in a more dominating fashion. Gambhir, as a player himself, used to say under MS Dhoni that, MS Dhoni's policy of take it to the last over, take it as close as possible, and let the opposition make more mistakes. Gambhir didn't believe in that. He always said that I want to finish it in the 47th, 48th over. Don't want to leave it too late. So even amongst the team, there was always like, multiple approaches or the right way of doing things. Um, I wonder what your thoughts are on this. Obviously, no right or wrong answer, but how do you evaluate, or how should teams evaluate their fans, and should they even think about, are we keeping them happy?
Ben, I feel like this question is specifically targeted towards you.
Thanks. So, do we care as a cricket fan, do we care about the style of play
The
versus
approach
the
versus
approach
results, I
versus the
guess.
results? Uh, I'm not going to deny that the whole Bazball thing has been a wild ride, and it's one that I've enjoyed. But would I rather the team win or be exciting? I would rather win, even if it's ugly.
Yeah.
Personally, I'm not speaking for the entire body of cricket fans here, but I don't know what you guys think, but yeah,
I,
I would rather win.
I have bias as a fan. I think the team should play for me. Um, I think so. I mean, in an ideal world, yes, the approach and the results go our way. But, to echo what Ben said, listen, I'll take an ugly win any day. I know, it's funny. Sometimes when I'm following the Reddit, the Reddit threads for, any ongoing games, there'll be like 2 or 3 overs where there's no run in test matches, right? And then people start questioning, oh, they're not rotating the strike. Why is this batter, playing so slow? There's no context. The bowler is on top. The conditions are, very friendly to the bowler. There's no nuance about maybe the batter is just like playing him out and just like waiting to cash in when the bowler is tired or when conditions get better. And I think it's just reflective of, the current times we live in, all the TikToks and, everything fast, fast, we need everything fast kind of mentality. And so I don't really subscribe to that. If let's say India playing Australia, um, even the famous GABA test where, Rishabh Pant scored the winning runs, I don't care that it came towards almost the end of the day's play. I didn't want them to score at 4 or 5 runs and over. They had enough time to bat out, and they did. There was a phase where Pujara was just taking blows after blows. I was not complaining like, oh, why isn't he hitting it for fours? Like, just or get off the strike. I wasn't complaining about that. I admired the fact that he was taking his time, and that was the right approach at the same and at that time. Similarly, in the previous game, Ravichandran Ashwin and Hanuman Vihari, they batted for God knows how many overs. It felt like 30 or 40 overs, and they scored like 20 runs to save the game. You cannot tell me that was not thrilling. Sure, they were not, it didn't seem like the game was moving anywhere, but it was thrilling in the way that you were seeing a team fight for survival against this
Mhm.
other team who have been on top for so long. And I think that's the beauty of cricket in general compared to every other sport. So yes, I do want cricket to be entertaining, mostly, but when it comes to supporting my team, winning comes first. Like if, let's say India was doing basketball, right? And if they were putting up like the same results, like in the sense like losing more than they were winning, I wouldn't still be like saying, "Oh, at least they're entertaining us." Listen, if I wanted entertainment all the time, I'll go watch a movie, or I watched like some stand-up comic do a set. But no, I'm supporting my team because I want them to play well and win. And there's only so much you can kind of tell yourself like, "Hey, at least they've been entertaining us."
I would agree with both of you. I think there is certainly a space of looking at the approach, though I think it's obviously it's not all the time, but if you have a team which is very dominant, we've had areas when Australia, for example, in the early 2000s, or the women's team, Australian women's team, have been extremely dominant. Those teams probably have a little more space of worrying about, hey, let's win it the right way. But I think pretty much everywhere else it's more about let's just get over the line, and put in the fight and just get it done with. And I think that's where I personally have changed my opinion over the years, because growing up, when MS Dhoni set a 8-1 field to Australia in a home test, and it was called defensive and it was called slowing down the game and all of that, I was very critical of that. Same thing with Nasser Hussain, pushing Ashley Giles to bowl to the legs of Sachin Tendulkar, which frustrated the great man so much that he got stumped out for the first and only time in his Test career. Um, all of those tactics seemed very negative, seemed like not playing cricket, the right way in quotes, but they were effective. Dhoni got the draw he needed. Nasser Hussain got the wicket of Tendulkar. So at the end of the day, it's about improving your chances to win. And yeah, I think the win definitely is primary. But what I find interesting about our sort of conclusion, at least the three of us coming to the conclusion that win is more important, is I think the casual fan, the ones who are not looking at the nuances that us we look at, we look at the players in question, how the ball is doing, how the pitch is doing, all these things. I think the casual fan also care about the win more than this. So it's funny because I think we are all meeting in the same point from that perspective. Because yeah, to the casual fan, if you're winning, they're probably going to gloss over the details on who failed that test or who scored slowly, as long as the result is in their favor.
But the casual fan is only looking at the end result. They're not looking at what gets them to that result. And I
Oh,
think that's
100%.
where, as seasoned fans, we're looking at the ebb and flow of the game. How is the team like fighting back and getting to that position? And there's something to admire in that. You can't just have a linear like dominating from ball one to end. Sure, the team wins, but is that truly entertaining? It's if there's no contest, it's not entertaining, and that's where the fun is when both teams are fighting really hard and then one team comes out on top.
Absolutely. No, I guess my point was, yep, we look at the details, we look at the nuances, and we still end up at the same answer as casual
Yeah,
fans who only care about the result. Um,
yeah.
but on that note, this was a fascinating deep dive into legacy. I think we already, like, as we were talking, we came up with at least a couple of other topics that we could, talk about in another episode. But yeah, thanks, Benny, and Ben, for your time. It's been a great conversation.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.